Judges, and we kind of left off at chapter 8, and we finished chapter 7. We're going to back up just a little bit, because when I have taught through Judges before, spent a lot of time on Gideon. I've taught Gideon at camps, and so my focus was not so much the nation of Israel when I had studied it in times past, but what God was doing in the life of Gideon. And when I get to this spot where we're at right now, where they defeated the enemy, that's usually about the time that I'm in the last day of camp when I'm speaking on this, and you got to bring it to a wrap, so you bring it over to where at the end of all this, they kind of slide back to doing stuff they shouldn't do, and they take all the victory spoils and they take the gold out of that and melt it down into an ephod, which he's not supposed to make, and it's supposed to be something that priests use, and then he uses it, and it says it became a stumbling block and an idol to the nation of Israel. And so, like, I know where the story of Gideon goes, but this week I've studied like past that. Like, I know we'll get to it, but I've never, I don't say never, it's been a long time since I've really had a chance to dig in deep into what's going on in this passage. It's one of those stories that so-and-so kills so-and-so, and then so-and-so joined the army, and they killed so-and-so, and you just kind of, it's easy to read fast, get past it, and say they won. And I thought, I can't do that, especially while I'm teaching on Sunday mornings on how to slow down, read what's there, observe what's there. And so I did. And man, it is full. It is, some of it goes deep enough that it may take a couple weeks to get it all out. And I even wondered, like, is it something we need to do right now? And if this were a Sunday morning, well, I would say no, not really. But this is the Sunday night crowd. That's what I meant. You'd be the Sunday night crowd if we had one. You're the Wednesday night crowd, and you want to know what's there, and it really sets up for 1st and 2nd Samuel that come next. When is the first time that the nation of Israel asks for a king? And who is it? Saul. And they say, we want a king. And God tells them, what for? You got me. A king's going to do all these things for you. You don't want a king. And so in my mind, I always had that as the start of them wanting a king. But yet, with Gideon, when he wins, they said, let's set you up as king. It really goes all the way back to there. And Gideon says, well, no, I'm not going to be your king, and neither will my son, and neither will my grandson. And so I think it is foundational to understand what's going on in Israel here as we will finish the book of Judges in a few more weeks and head on into 1 Samuel. And so we're gonna try to take our time with it. And we're not going anywhere, right? I mean, as long as we have something to study every Wednesday night, what's the hurry? And so we're going to back up just a little bit to understand some things in this story that I want to kind of show you. There are several different times in this story, from what we just read and what we're about to read, that God calls people into action. And I think it's important to look at how God calls people to action. Does he do it the same for everybody? How did he call Gideon into action? The Lord came to him in the threshing floor and then went through some signs and miracles and receiving worship and all kinds of stuff. He really spent some time on Gideon. And then when it was time to call everybody to battle, when Gideon was to go to battle, did he call all 12 tribes? No, it just 5, leaving 7 out. And so we're going to kind of take a quick look at this. Let's start in verse 8. Chapter 8. And then we're going to back up and see some things prior to it. Okay? But I want you to know where we're going. Now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian?" And they challenged him vigorously. This is not, "Hey, by the way, bro, why didn't you do, we could have helped." It was not like that. It was, "How dare you not call us? If anybody's going to get glory, it should be us too." That's really what's behind all that. There's pride there.
And they criticized him sharply.
Criticized him sharply. Like they are hitting him. Well, let me ask you a question. Did God tell Gideon to go get them? In fact, of all the people that came, what did God do with the people that did come? Sent them home, all but 300. And so God calls them in different ways, and his answer to them is kind of unique. And we'll take a moment on this. It says, "But he answered them, 'What have I accomplished compared to you?'" Whose ego is he stroking? The Ephraimites. He says, "Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer?" Now let me just stop right there. Do you know what the gleaning versus the full harvest is? What is a gleaning according to the Old Testament? Does anybody remember? The leftovers. There was like on certain fields, they weren't allowed to harvest all the way to the edge. It was like, I forget, an arm's reach in or something. There's some distance that they had to leave for people walking by to be able to reach in and grab some. Or after they've had their first run through the field, then the poor could go through and glean after that whatever was left over. Like Ruth, the story of Ruth, that's a big part of that story. And when he says, isn't the gleaning, the leftover, the garbage that you don't need is better than what we have in the full harvest? If you take the full harvest of what we get, your gleanings are better. Yeah. And I think they were able to defend some. There are some things, I know what you're saying. But here's a interesting thing. Let's go back to chapter 6 for a minute. Chapter 6, verse 33. This is back when the beginning of the story of Gideon. Tells us a little bit about Gideon. It says, "Now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning" who? The Abiezrites. That's who Gideon is talking about when he's talking to the Ephraimites. When he says, aren't the Abiezrites full harvest, not even comparable to the gleanings of your fields? Like, you guys, yeah, you got it. You're up there. You're the people. You're the ones that everybody wishes they were. It goes on to say, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. So we got just a few, the Abiezrites, Asher, Zebulun, Naphtali, Manasseh, not a lot of the tribes being called up that the Lord had him call up. Gideon's home is where, I just want you to think about this for a minute. The people that God called up were the Abiezrites and the people closest to Gideon's town where Gideon grew up. What do we know about those people? They're the least. Gideon made that argument when the Lord came to him and said, do you realize who you're talking to? I'm the bottom of the barrel. In other words, you should be going and talking to the Ephraimites. That would have been the mindset. What else do we know about the people that grew up around? They were all Baal worshipers. These are the townspeople, the same people that said, let's kill Gideon, are the ones called up to go to battle with Gideon. Now, I don't know what all that means, but it's remarkable to me that Gideon forgave those people enough to trust them in battle. And I just find that absolutely amazing. So we've got Manasseh, which is the city of Ophrah, is there. Gideon's home, where he stood against, and they called him Jerubbaal. Then you got Asher, Zebulun, Naphtali, a total of 5 tribes out of the 12. 7 tribes not summoned. The 300 were from the 5 tribes. Why didn't Gideon call more people? It's a simple answer. God. The Spirit of the Lord is the one that called him, really. Yeah, because God didn't want more people. All right? So what we're seeing is how God called them up. That's part of the key, is how God called up the 300. See, God is, though, interested in involving more, but he doesn't just want involvement. He wants involvement with the right heart. There were more people that could have gotten involved. I mean, how often God said, bring everybody out to battle, and then still had them stand there and watch as he rained down the hail on them. But he didn't want to do that for people that were so against him that they only thought of themselves. And God is not just spreading a workforce, he's spreading an attitude. He wants us to have a certain attitude about work. And kind of watch how he does this. God wanted to start with a small number so that he would be glorified and they would know that it was God. This is the key. And we're going to watch some plays on word between who does it and who people feel like they should give credit to. I don't know how to word that, but you'll see what I mean in a moment. What made Gideon and the 300 so special is their total dependence on God. What did they go to war with? Trumpets and lights and jars. The lights and jars and trumpets are to let the enemy know exactly where they are. And they got no weapons. They wanted in chapter 8, verses 1 to 3, they wanted to know why Gideon made the choices that he had made. Instead of defending himself, he praised them. Watch how he praised them, though. Verse 2, but he answered them, the Ephraimites, what have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer? In other words, I'm not saying we're more important than you. You guys are more important than us. You're still the upper class, we're the lower class. We get it. That's what he means by that. Now, verse 3. God gave Oreb and Zeb, the Midianite leaders, into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you? So genius. He doesn't say, well, look what you did compared to me. He says, look what God did through you compared to me. There's a difference. There's a difference in the way we talk to each other. That's why it says, don't ever make promises, say if the Lord wills. Like, those are your promises. If the Lord wills, this is what's going to happen. This is what I'm going to do. It's like God needs to be behind everything. And he says, what was I able to do compared to what God did through you? And so at this, their resentment against him subsided. Well, it sounds like Gideon just knows how to sweet talk, doesn't it? But we're going to find that he turns from his sweet talk to some other cities in a moment here where he just calls judgment down on them. Look at verse 4 and 5 now. Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted, yet keeping up the pursuit, came to the Jordan and crossed it. He said to the men of Sukkoth, give my troops some bread. They are worn out, and I'm still pursuing Zebah and Zulmunna, the kings of Midian. So 2 of them Ephraimites got. There's 2 more that Gideon and his 300 men are chasing. But the officials of Sukkoth said, do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zulmunna in your possession? I mean, you already got them? No, we're pursuing them. Then why would we get rid of our resources to help you? What if you lose? If you lose, we've A, lost our resources, and B, made an enemy of the people that are going to defeat you. And the last thing we want to do is make the Midianites mad at us because we don't want that conflict. Man, that's pretty bad, isn't it?
Like they didn't think about the fact that 300 had just thousands of them on the run.
Yeah, you would think that if you saw thousands running by and then these 300 show up, you know, like, but you see how the Ephraimites had one type of arrogance and self-centeredness, and now we see it in Sukkoth and in Sukkoth. Gideon replied, just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zulmunna into my hands, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars. He was not happy at all. Whatever happened to the kinder, gentler Gideon? Oh, but who are we compared to you? You see, the Ephraimites had as much, if not more, arrogance than Sukkoth, but the difference was they joined the battle. They did something. They didn't have the full right attitude, or they could have been called up a lot earlier. But God used them. They went and they were appeased. Sukkoth said, you're not getting any of our bread. We're not helping at all. They did not join and enlist. God, I asked the question, how did God enlist Gideon? We know that story. The Lord came to him. How did God enlist the 300? He picked them out of 30,000. How did God enlist the Ephraimites? Gideon calls them and says, we're coming by here. Can you come down and take over a certain portion up by the Jordan, from the Jordan to this other spot? It's in verse 24. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim saying, come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth Barah. And so, how did they get called into action? Gideon called them and said, we need you. Well, now we've got Sukkoth being called to action through Gideon, and they just flat refuse. They're like, no, we're going to hoard our stuff. Do you see the difference between Sukkoth and the Ephraimites? The Ephraimites said, you should have called us earlier. Sukkoth says, I need this. I'm not sharing. That's a more common attitude than we'd like to think. When people don't realize, they don't take into account that if you give towards what the Lord is doing, He'll replace it. And it's kind of, I'm really glad that our church is going well. There's a great attitude. I'm just loving our church. But I've been part of churches that struggle for different reasons. Many of them just outside things, the devil fighting in different ways. And I've seen offerings tank. And people say, well, I'll give when I know they're going to make it. You know what the problem with that is? They ain't going to make it. Not if I'm not going to support it until it's succeeded. That's not faith. And so there's some lessons that we can learn from them. And go ahead.
One thing between the Ephraimites and Sukkoth is we can see that God still uses arrogant people.
Yeah. Yeah, He can. God, aren't you glad that God doesn't wait till we're perfect? She's got an Android, I think, with a bug in it. Might have a virus. That thing just ding, a ding, a ding, a ding. And she can't turn it on. I tried. And, good. If not, there's a sink. You could just put it under the water and it will quit. It'll get quiet. In verse 7 of chapter 8, Gideon replied, and I told you what he said he'd do to them, but I want you to not miss this phrase, when the Lord has given. Do you see the confidence in that phrase? Why is he so confident? The reason for his confidence is in that phrase as well. It's because the Lord is doing it, and he knows that. And to go along with what Hannah's saying, even though Gideon realizes that the Lord is doing this, and that the victory will be there, it's sure because of the Lord, I would say just like God used the Ephraimites, even though they were arrogant, God is using Gideon despite his spiritual flaws that we're going to find out about as we keep reading. And the good news is, I'm glad we don't have to be perfect before God uses us. The challenge is, the more you want him to use you, the better you need to be. And let's not forget both sides of that. What does it teach us? That God didn't want to give the victory to those who thought it had been done in human strength. That he didn't want to give the win to the Ephraimites because they already considered themselves top dog. We saved everybody. And God says, nah, you're not the one I'm giving the victory to. He wants it to be the person who will say, God is the one doing this. And that's what we'll see Gideon repeatedly do. Even the Ephraimites, their focus was on man's strength. Their problem was pride. They obeyed, but not with the best attitude. God still used them. God worked through them. Gideon understood their pride, but instead of judging them, he simply pointed all things to God in their presence. And he gave God credit for what they had done. Gideon showed patience, kindness, even a desire to teach. He simply reminded them that they didn't do it, God did, but in a non-controversial way. He simply said, hey, let's rejoice together. You did more than I did. I'm not so sure that they did more than Gideon did. But Gideon is not talking about just this one thing. He's saying, overall, you are a bigger tribe. Like, he said the same thing to the Lord. That was his argument. Why are you picking me? Let me see where I want to go with this. All right, let's see when Gideon does come back to punish them. No, we're going to keep right on going through. Is that okay? And then we'll get to those verses that I was going to get to in a minute. All right, where we leave off, 6, 7, 8. Verse 8. From there he went up to Peniel and made the same request of them, but they answered of the men of Succoth the same as the men of Succoth had. So he said to the men of Peniel, when I return in triumph, I will tear down this tower. I got to tell you, when I first read this, I thought, well, which is worse, to have my tower torn down or to be beaten by thorns and briars? I kind of thought, well, yeah, tear down the tower. Leave me alone. But we'll see why tearing down that tower has a little bit more power behind it. Verse 10, now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Kakor with a force of about 15,000 men. How many chasing them? 300. Just think about that for a minute. And like Mark was saying, you're chasing 15,000 men with 300. You would think that these cities would say, I don't know what you got in those 300, but whew. There's a force of about 15,000 men, all that were left of the armies of the eastern peoples. Now that, 15,000 may sound like a lot, but it was well over 100 and some thousand when they started. To have
120,000 swordsmen had fallen,
plus others. Can you? Yeah. They've lost 120. If you started out with 120 and you're down to 15,000, 15,000 doesn't sound like so much anymore. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. Gideon, Yeah, so with the 15,000 are there, and 120,000, that would mean 135,000 minimum. Well, 120,000 swordsmen, and yeah, and then 15,000 more, whatever they are,
But they had camels
that you couldn't count. Like, verse 11, Gideon went up by the route of the nomads east of Nobah and Jogbehah and attacked the unsuspecting army. Zebah and Zalmunna, the two kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. Wow. Remember, these are not the most vigilant warriors. They're wore out, just chasing people down. I can't run anymore. Give me some bread. And nobody wanted to feed them. So Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from the battle by the pass of Heresh. He caught a young man of Sukkoth and questioned him, and the young man wrote down for him the names of the 77 officials of Sukkoth. That kid was into politics. Yeah, can you name 10 council members? The elders of the town. Verse 15, then Gideon came and said to the men of Sukkoth, here are Zebah and Zalmunna. Like, uh-oh. I guess you did win. About whom you taunted me by saying, do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give you bread to your exhausted men? He took the elders of the town and taught the men of Sukkoth a lesson. I love the way the Bible words that. By punishing them with desert thorns and briars. He just whipped them. Oh, I hear it raining. So we're going to stay dry today. He also pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the town. I don't know if they were in the tower and he pulled the tower down, which made them die, or if he tore down their tower of recognition. Look who we are. And they had this big tower and tore it down and then went in and killed the men. But there's some judgment happening here. And he even did that before he killed Zebah and Zalmunna. Verse 18, then he asked Zebah and Zalmunna, what kind of men did you kill at Tabor? Men like you, they answered, each one with the bearing of a prince. Gideon replied, those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you. Turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, kill them. But Jether did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and was afraid. Zebah and Zalmunna said, come, do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength. So Gideon stepped forward and killed them and took the ornaments off their camels' necks. Now that may not seem like a big deal to you. We're going to talk more about this part of the story starting next week. But his oldest son didn't have the courage to obey Gideon to take out the enemies who had killed, what's his name? Jether's uncles, right? Am I reading that right? Jether's uncles would have been Gideon's brothers. And we don't know how old he was, but he was young enough to have a sword. I mean, old enough to have a sword, but young enough to be called a boy. Because it says, but Jether did not draw his sword. So he had one. And what's interesting is as we continue to read this next week, there's going to be just a sneak peek. Look at verse 23. But Gideon told them, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. And, it wasn't there. Look at verse 22. The Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson. Isn't that what it says? So the boy had to be old enough to be a dad?
No, I don't think he's saying physically the grandson that is alive right now. But
It could be the future grandson, your offspring. It could be. I wondered about that. But that's going to come up in a conversation later.
I think, I don't know, I don't think Gideon might have a son at this point, but I don't think he has a grandson. Because at the beginning of the story,
Well,
we were talking about him being like a teenager kind of age.
Right, but he does have a son, and his son's old enough to carry a sword, but young enough to be called a boy. So I don't think Gideon's a teenager, but I think he's young enough.
Yeah, and
Boy would have been probably 12 or under.
Yeah.
Zeba and Zalmunna called Gideon. He said, what kind of men did you kill? Men like you, each one with the bearing of a prince. Like, he was like pretty stately, you know?
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, we're going to get into some interesting stuff next week about the family.
An interesting note on the verse 21, where he took the ornaments off her camel's neck. I looked up the cross-reference, and it was Isaiah says, in that day the Lord will snatch away their finery, the bangles and headbands and crescent necklaces. And the note talks about them being probably, it was in the shape of crescent being a moon, to be worshiping the moon god. They would put necklaces on their camels to show that they were.
Which gods they were serving. Yeah, definitely. This is a battle of the gods. And that's going to be made even more clear. We're 8:02, but I'm going to give you a little sneak peek of where we're going next week. I'm just 1 minute, like literally. Look at, there's going to be really the first parable given to us in the scripture. The son of Gideon comes out. His name's Jotham, and he tells of this tree. He says, verse 9, verse 8. One day the trees went out to anoint a king for themselves. Yeah, I'm in chapter 9, verse 8. One day the trees went out to anoint a king for themselves. They said to the olive tree, be our king. It's referring to Gideon. But the olive tree answered, should I give up my oil by which both gods and humans are honored? Well, let that sink in as we ponder that till next week. Something to think about, isn't it? What do you think that means? Hopefully I'll figure it out by next week so I can tell you. It is little g plural, and it comes up a couple times in that parable that's coming up. And it's all working together to head them in a certain direction. Any other comments, questions? Dear Heavenly Father, I just thank you for this evening, being able to dig into your word a little bit. And Lord, the one thing that we should be taking away from this is that when you call us to serve, we should serve. We always know that it's you doing the work. We're just there to be the tool that you can use. But all victory comes from you, and all credit should go to you. And but we don't have to wait till we're perfect to be used by you. We should start now and start giving you the credit, and that in itself will teach us to mature and to grow. Help us to do that. In Jesus' name, amen.